犬は犬公園で許可されていません。犬公園に近づかないでください。この戦いの最初の2ラウンドは表示されません。You may recall that during the early 2000s, there were a string of American horror films released into theaters that were actually remakes of Japanese horror films. And for this week's battle, we're going to be taking a look at the film that started it all. Representing the old, we have the 1998 film Ring by Hideo Nakata, and representing the new, we have the 2002 remake by Gore Verbinski. Yes, that Gore Verbinski. Hold it, stop the fight card. We're going to skip the first 2 rounds. Here's why. If you look at the full article, link in the description, you'll see that the first 2 rounds ended in a draw. Both the story and the atmosphere, there was no real major things that tipped the scales in favor of one film or another. In the terms of the story, both had their really good moments, but both also had their fair share of problems. It was kind of a case that neither one was really better than the other in terms of story, and it was the same case with atmosphere as, well, a lot of the shots were essentially mirrors of one another. I mean, look at these 2 shots. Kind of freaky, isn't it? So rather than kind of have a really long video where the first 2 rounds are basically just long drawn out and me essentially saying that neither film was better than another, we're just going to jump straight to the tiebreaker. Cue the fight card. So what's the tiebreaker, you may ask? Well, we're going to take a look at the very thing that both films are centered around. The tape. More specifically, both the tape itself and how the curse of the tape plays out in both films. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of either The Ring, or the original novel by Koji Suzuki, the story focuses around an urban legend regarding a cursed videotape. Yes, videotape, the format that preceded DVD by, well, I don't know how many years, but it was the format before DVD. Point being, if you watched this videotape, you would get a phone call that would inform you that you had 7 days to live. And basically, after 7 days, to the exact minute, you would die. Simply put. And, well, the only way to really free yourself from the curse was to essentially copy the tape and show it to someone else. Yes, I understand that that's not revealed until much later in the film. I know it maybe seemed kind of spoilerish, but really, people, it's been 11 years since the film came out. More specifically, this film. So, really, the complaints about spoilers, no real point at this point. It's like Rosebud. We all know about Rosebud. In the case of the 1998 version, we open with the image of the well looking up, and instead of it just being a solid ring like in the remake, we see someone's face. We also see the footage of the 2 mirrors, one showing Sadako, the other showing her mother brushing her hair. Then we also see a few other clues regarding the origins of the tape, such as the newspaper clipping regarding the volcanic eruption, footage of people dying from said eruption, the whole person pointing into the ocean, the distorted folk saying of frolic and brine, goblins be thine, and the first kanji of the child's name, the child being Sadako. The first kanji we see is Sada, so her name was probably written like this. If you know about kanji, feel free to correct me in the comments. The 2002 version also contains the mirrors and the well, and like I mentioned, the footage is pretty much almost exactly mirrored, but we also see some other things that also provide insight into the origins of the tape as explained in that film. We see the falling ladder, we see the floating chair, we see a lot of bugs, and we also see the plastic bag and the thrashing around. And, well, the one thing I do have to say is that between the two, the 2002 version of the tape features a lot faster cutting. As such, it's a little more jarring, not so much as mysterious and, like, eerie, per se, but it's definitely a lot more jarring with its faster cuts. Now we have the curse itself. We're going to focus specifically on the scene in which the main character's ex-husband is killed by the child in question. In the 98 version, she's called Sadako. In the 2002 version, she's known as Samara. So really, we're going to focus specifically on those scenes. When it comes to the original, one thing that I liked is that you never really see Sadako's face. I mean, you see her crawl out of the TV, and you do see her eye when it's kind of the case of, oh, the guy is dead. But for the most part, the long hair pretty much keeps her face shrouded in mystery, which I guess makes sense since the person's supposed to be a child, and basically it's obviously someone much older playing the role. But it has that nice Lovecraftian element where the very idea of, oh, if you see her face, that's what's going to kill you or drive you insane, at least to that extent. Now, in the case of the 2002 version, it had some things I liked, but some things I didn't like. The things that I liked, I mean, the effect of actually seeing Samara crawl out of the TV is infinitely a lot more convincing than it is in the 98 version. It also helps that Samara is actually played by a child and not someone who's obviously older pretending to be a child. The one problem I had with the 2002 version of the scene, however, is that it got a little overindulgent with the makeup. I mean, I understand having Samara look like the waterlogged corpse and having just that creepy, angry face that just... yeah. But transitioning that rotted look to the victims doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from a story standpoint. The key thing with the story is that, well, the deaths are pretty much written off as sudden heart failure. It's kind of a case of where they're not really able to identify what killed them aside from the fact that their heart's no longer beating and they essentially have a face that's frozen in fright, something that the original did really well. However, with the 2002 version, we're supposed to believe that the face almost kind of decomposed to look the way Samara looked in the well. Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because really when you're thinking about it, that's not something that would be dismissed as easily when you really think about it. I mean, if a body suddenly decomposed that quickly, yeah, it would be weird. They wouldn't be able to write it off as sudden heart failure or just being completely baffled. That would just definitely be something that you would need to look into. And I understand, yeah, it may be kind of symbolic, but they never make that part clear. It's for these reasons that I'm going to give this round to the 1998 version. I know that may seem kind of like a bit of a hipsterish thing to do, think, oh yeah, the original is so much better, but really, it does things in a little more of a subtle way, although yeah, the kind of turning the thing black and white is kind of dumb when you think about it, but just the idea of seeing the corpses not as like decomposed, but actually looking like someone died from fright, just makes the whole thing a lot more eerie. And really, that's kind of what counts, it's just that degree of subtlety. That's really the major deciding point here. This was a close battle, I'll admit, but I can't really in good conscience say that one film is ultimately superior to the other. It's just, I can't. It goes against the very foundation of Monster Clash, but I can't. Both films are well produced, but they also have their fair share of flaws and things that I found mildly annoying. In the case of the original, it was the sudden telepathy of the ex-husband, and in the case of the remake, it was the kid. Yes, I can understand kids can be creepy, but you already have one creepy kid in the case of Samara. You do not need another. Both films are really good. I highly recommend both of them if you're a fan of horror films. It just really depends on whether or not you're into Japanese-style filmmaking or American-style filmmaking. And one of the key issues with why the battle was so hard to decide is because one thing that you have to keep in mind when looking at stuff like this is that some things from the original just can't translate over to the US. What you have to consider is that in Japan, one of the dominant religions, or basically the dominant religion for the longest time, was polytheistic, and I may be getting it fairly wrong, but based on what research I've done into Shinto, the basic idea is that there are spirits and kind of everything, so to speak, is that everything has kind of a spirit. Some of them are gods, some of them are just spirits, and so really, you don't have to go to as many lengths to convince a Japanese audience that there are some supernatural stuff in your story to have it believable. In the case of the US market though, you do. Because a lot of the dominant religions in the US are monotheistic. The idea of spirits being in everything is not something you can really easily communicate to people here in the US, and so really you have to draw from a lot of the monotheistic elements of those religions in order to make things scary. If you've seen The Conjuring, you know what I'm talking about. It draws heavily on a lot of the exorcism and Judeo-Christian God versus the devil sort of storylines that we see in a lot of those horror films. And so, although the film did a good job of translating what it could, it's understandable that they wouldn't be able to get everything right, because really, they went to enough lengths to try to explain who Samara is and that whole thing. If they tried translating it thing like literally cut and paste, the film just wouldn't have worked. And so really, that was the major reason why it made the battle so hard to decide, is that aside from being almost like recreated beat for beat, there was just some things that you know that can't translate over. I mean, that's just how it comes down to. So really, take a look at both films, decide for yourself, but for now, this battle comes to a close by a hair in favor of the 1998 version of Ring. Not the strongest episode, I will admit that. Hopefully next week we'll have a much better battle, as we'll bring Monster Clash 2013 to a groovy end in a cabin in the woods. But for now, good night.